Good day, my beautiful children. Today is Monday, May the 4th. Happy Star Wars Day. Ferg, I know you're out there. May the 4th be with you. Live long and prosper. Ferg's head just exploded, by the way. I just used a Star Trek reference on Star Wars Day. So that's going to really upset him probably the rest of the day. I'm pretty excited about that. Speaking of Star Wars, there'll be a special Star Wars themed story at the end of this. But today we're getting back to talking about um, there we go, talking about the beginning of the film industry and the studio system. So that out of there. All right. So let's talk about the silent film era. We saw last week. We saw the kinescopic films that Edison and others created. Those were those short, just little bits of film with no plot, no dialogue, etc. It was all amateur hour at that point. Like there were no actors, there were no directors, it was just people messing around with new technology. The early 1900s, film actually becomes a viable industry. So during the silent film era, and the reason why it was silent is even though they had the ability to record sound, they did not have yet the technology to sync up sound with moving pictures in a movie. So that was going to be another couple decades before they could do that. But these silent films, they were still movies. So they get longer. We have an actual narrative. So the movies are now telling stories. I talked to you guys last week about Nickelodeons. There were 10,000 of these small theaters in the United States by 1909. And again, they were called Democracy's Theater because anybody could afford to see them and everybody wanted to see them. So you had all kinds of people going in there, wealthy, poor, middle class, all trying to see this new technology. Anyway, um, the movies become longer, and now we start to get people that are going to do this as a job, as a profession. So we get actors, silent film actors like Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and uh, people like that. And then we get directors like Cecil B. DeMille and others that are going to do this for real as actual work. Um, so these movies, they were just like movies today, other than they did not have dialogue or sound. And I explained this to you last week, but they would have either kind of like title slides that would explain to you what was about to happen, or they would have subtitles. So this is when the film industry really takes off. It starts out on the East Coast because that's where um, the money was, and that's where the creators and the owners of these studios were. Thomas Edison, created one of the very first studios called the Trust, and he created essentially a monopoly for filmmaking. Well, Edison, I guess, luckily for all of us, didn't know much about the film industry, so his company fails, but others pick up the slack where he leaves off. And eventually, this all moves out west. The problem with filming in the East Coast is one, it's expensive. Two, there's not as much land available to build studio lots and sets and things like that. And three, the weather is crappy half the year, and so it moved out west. They needed to move to a place where land was cheap and plentiful and where they had all kinds of different terrain. They had beaches and deserts and mountains and other things. So they went out to California and found an area that became known originally as Hollywood Land. And now, of course, we know as Hollywood. And that's where the movie industry is still centered today in the United States. So one of the first things they did is they created what was called vertical integration, and that's where the studios, they owned every aspect of the movie making process, and they would create movies like you would create products in an assembly line. Like you make a car, you own all the parts and you own all the factories, and it starts at point A and then moves on to point B, and at the end you have a finished car. Well, that's how they made movies back then. So the studios, they'd own the lots and the sets, they'd own the cameras and the movie making equipment, they'd own the film production companies, and they own everything. That means they also own the actors and the directors. And so, actors and directors, if you wanted to work in pictures and movies, you sign an exclusive contract with Warner Brothers or 20th Century Fox or whoever, and then they owned you. And that's why, if you're a fan of older movies and older, classic movie stars, they're pretty much they're typecast. John Wayne plays the same role in every movie he was ever in. He plays John Wayne. It's just, whether it's a western or a war picture or a romance or a comedy, he's always playing John Wayne. He was typecast. Marilyn Monroe, same thing. Um, so this is good and bad. It's good in the sense that Hollywood cranked out tons of movies during this time, but it's bad in the sense that um, it left no choice for directors, writers, or actors. The studios owned you, and they told you what your next role was. And today you get big time actors who want to break away from their normal. Like Jim Carrey is a comedian, but he's done some very serious films. Um, that would never have happened back then. The studio would tell you what to do, and tell you, here's your next movie, do it. And you had no choice. If you wanted to make movies, you had to play ball and do it their way. So um, during this time, like I said, the studios owned everything, and that included the theaters themselves. Even back then, though, we had pirating of movies, except not unlike today, where you just jump online and illegally download, which I know all of you have done. You sinners. I haven't, obviously, but I'm sure you all have. Well, people would steal movies and copy them by literally stealing the film, the movie, and copying it. Um, and the studios also did something called block booking, where they basically would force theaters um, to uh, to book their film for a specific amount of time. And then also, if you wanted their big film, you had to take a bunch of their other films or crap films and book them too. So you want Gone with the Wind? Here's 5 other movies from our studio that you have to also pay for. And also during this time, they began to market overseas in Europe, although that is not a two-way street. It's very difficult to find foreign films today in theaters in America, whereas every American movie can be found overseas and all over the world. All right, so I promised a story about Star Wars, so here it is, and it kind of deals with the studios. So George Lucas, Star Wars is really the first big movie he made, and when he went to pitch this idea, which as great a movie as the original Star Wars is, if you try and explain it to somebody who's never seen it, it's ridiculous. Basically, it's a soap opera set in outer space. Actually, it's a western slash soap opera, but it's set in outer space, and it involves a main character who's a farmer, but also he has these superpowers that he doesn't know. And then he's trying to save this princess, who, by the way, spoiler alert, is his sister, and the evil enemy he has to defeat is secretly his dad. And also there's a giant talking bear. I mean, it's crazy. It's insane. So when he went to first pitch this movie, nobody wanted it. Finally, he got to Fox, and Fox was willing to take a chance on this new director with this crazy idea. And so when they went and sat down to do the financials for this, when you make a movie as a director, you get paid a flat rate, depending on how famous you are and how good your movies are. That depends on how much you get paid. Well, Lucas was a brand new director; he wasn't getting paid hardly anything. So the other way you make money is on points, and points are based on ticket sales. And so when they sat down to do the deal, Lucas said, "I don't want any points," and they were like, "What? You're an idiot." Fine, what do you want? And he goes, well, I want 2 things. Number one, I want sequel rights. And they probably laughed at him, because at that time, late 70s, mid 70s, they didn't do sequels like they do today. So they signed off on that and said, fine, you can have sequel rights. And then he said, the last thing I want is I want merchandising rights. And they said, what's that? And he goes, well, I don't know, maybe if we want to make toys with this or whatever. And they probably, couldn't sign the deal quick enough, because nobody had done marketing or merchandising of movies really up to that point. Think about that for a minute. That's probably the best deal in the history of Hollywood for a director, and the worst deal for a studio. When's the last time you've ever been anywhere and not seen a Star Wars something? Whether it's, a video game or an action figure or a lunchbox or a toothpaste or whatever. Everything is everywhere you go is a Star Wars something. And so um, that deal ended up making George Lucas a multi-billionaire, and then of course he sold the rights to those movies to Disney for billions of dollars. He re-released he George Lucas, good director, great businessman. He ended up getting divorced from his wife in California. The state of California, there are no fault divorces where the wife gets half of everything that was made when you were married. And so what Lucas did is in the 90s he re-released all the original Star Wars with just enough changes to make them considered to be new films, so that after his divorce his wife got nothing from the ticket sales or anything from those new movies. Pretty smart guy. So there's your story for today, and tomorrow we're going to pick up uh, again with the studio system, talk about the original Big Five studios, and then there were three smaller studios. And then the rest of the week, we're going to get into movie making by the decade. It's kind of an interesting topic. So that's your stuff for today, and I will see you tomorrow. Cinco de Mayo. We'll try and throw something fun in there, and yeah. So have a great rest of your day, and peace and love, everybody.